So today, as you know, you have Dr. Scott Huff. He's a candidate for a faculty position in the School of Family Life. He obtained his bachelor's degree in our department in 2008, and then he went on to University of Connecticut and completed a master's and a PhD there in marriage and family therapy in 2015. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he's a professor and the program director of their MFT program at University of Central Missouri. He's published widely in the field in areas such as divorce, attachment and therapy, therapy with divorcing couples, helping children in divorced and single-parent families, and measurement issues in research. So join me in welcoming Dr. Huff.
All right, excellent. So I'm excited to be here and get to work with you guys and talk a bit. We're gonna just stick right with your guys' course content. This may be, I have no idea how your course goes. I've never been here in one of your classes, so it may be quite similar. This might be quite different, but we're gonna go through and have a pretty good time. Just as a follow up, you got a bit of a introduction. I usually, when I'm guest lecturing, like to include a little introductory slide. I'm doing it different this time. I recognize that like the major stages of my life all get represented by various animals. One of these is not like the other one, right? One of the extra pieces that we will reference quite a bit today because it's applicable to a lot of these discussions around anger and that type of stuff is that I worked at a therapeutic ranch facility. It was down in Cedar City. We would have girls, it was all for adolescent girls, and they would come and be with us usually for about a year and a half, working through a whole variety of issues and problems that they may be dealing with. One of the major programs there is that the girls would actually raise a baby calf. They would have calves assigned to them, and they would raise them, and it gave them a chance to sort through relationships and learn about responsibility, but then also sometimes learn about loss, right? Not every calf is going to make it, and even the ones that do are eventually going to be sold and sent off to feedlot. And for these girls who had all sorts of attachment injuries and problems, it gave them a really neat perspective. So those are some of the places. This isn't my very conservative, diehard Republican mother will not wear any regalia from the University of Central Missouri. I tell her it's a mule, that's a mule, not a donkey, but she yet refuses to do anything. So right now I'm at the University of Central Missouri. We're about an hour outside of Independence, Missouri. It's a fun little university. We've got a new marriage and family therapy program where I teach and am the program director as well. Any questions for me? Anything you're curious about? You'll get to know all sorts of fun things. I do want to check in a little about you guys and have a sense of who I'm working with. Kind of I'll just ask one question, which is kind of like, what are people planning to do with this class and this major? Like, what are the types of ways you're going to use this, whether it's more for your personal enrichment, to become a therapist, to become some other profession. How are people using this, or where are people going from here?
Therapy, social work.
Okay, excellent. You should be a marriage and family therapist, not a social worker.
I have advice, but I got into social work instead.
All right.
I'm doing social work also, except for with older adults.
Okay, excellent. Other ways. How many of you are going the therapy, social work route by raising hands?
Or
MFT, social work, LPC, psychology, whatever it is. We have some high hands, some middling hands. What are our other options? How are other people using this?
Family life education.
Excellent. I did my provisional CFLE, but never had an opportunity to do the practice part. So I think that's awesome. Other things? Anyone here just for the fun of it? Got it. There we go. Once I broke the ice there a little, you're okay with it. That's good. It's good to be here for the fun of it too. I say that, you will notice I have a tendency towards therapy. I like to tell my therapy stories, and that's oftentimes the lens from which I approach things. But I want us to take our time and think about other ways to do things. So if I'm too much on my therapy train, you can knock me back into line and say, Dr. Huff, what about us CFLEs? What about us who are just going to be parts of families or people? There's a lot of important stuff for us to talk about there as well. So one of the major things that I want to talk about and organize things around is the idea of theory. So my guess, I'm gonna venture a guess, and this always made me nervous when guest lecturers ask questions like this of my students. But when I say theory, like, what do people think of? Like, why do we do theory? What's the value of theory? Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like what everything is grounded on. I was not a huge fan of my theories class, but it was important because then it gave me a foundation where I can explain all the stuff that's going on with something concrete. So even though it was kind of boring to learn them all, they are useful in how you explain things.
Okay, great. Any additions there?
Also, it allows you to help predict things that may happen in the future.
Excellent. So we have an explanatory piece of it. We have a predictive piece of it. Any other pieces that we would add in there?
Models.
Say more.
The models that help you to kind of see where things go.
Yes. And
The trajectory or.
And I'm taking from that, like, part of it is about intervention as well, right? So in marriage and family therapy, we have models that not just describe, but they say, and here's what you do. Here's how you can manipulate that situation to change things. Okay? Any other reasons? Yeah.
Social science isn't an absolute. We don't know everything. Not everything is for sure. So having a guess, a roundabout estimate, things that could be, is where we is comfortable for the social science.
Yes. So and I think that's a great piece, and it's going to fit really well with our discussion today, because theories, I don't want it. Sometimes we go like, oh, that's just a theory, and throw it away. Theories are organizing principles. They're a way that we can take that information that we are getting, those things that we're seeing, and organize it to put it into a package and predict or evaluate or intervene or whatever it is. And they need to be tested, right? So then, can we name some of our major theories in family studies from our boring theories class? What's that? Attachment theory, great.
ABCX model.
Yeah, I could do the ABCX model. What's that?
Systems.
We have systems theory. Developmental. Is that like, when you say that, like family life cycle? Sometimes we use different words for the same, depending on where we're coming from. Others? What's that?
Learning theories.
We have learning theories, or good old behaviorism. Okay? These are all great theories. Will people be scared if I say, like, tell me about those theories? Can we do that? What if we, and let me throw just a little more up here. Everything you said is great. Some of those are already here. Some of them are not up here, but are still valid and really useful things to keep track of. What I want to ask is, picking one of these, can we associate or think about how anger, okay, the experience or idea of anger might fit in one of our theories, okay? Turn to a neighbor and see if you can brainstorm a little. Pick whichever, you can pick whichever is most comfortable between you, and talk a little. See if you can sort out how you might use a theory to help us understand this big idea of anger. We're not to the Butler article yet. Understand this big idea a bit better.
I think anger can be associated with exchange theory, because if someone feels anger and feels anger and hurts their partner in that regard, I think that partner will being because they won't see their relationship as and so the cost is not worth the price, and so they'll stop hurting their partner that way or something. Perhaps if that anger becomes a pattern or a habit that consistently is hurting their partner, if it's
Attachment theory, if someone is angry, the other person feels like they're more attachment. The other person might pursue the person who's angry.
Let's bring you back in. What are some things we came up with? What are some, or that your neighbor said? You can tattle on your neighbor if you want to say something brilliant that your neighbor connected. Yes.
I said I thought attachment because reading the article, and it was more about the relationship, less about reactionary anger.
Yeah, and so this article, and we will come back to this, right? This article puts this attachment lens about how it is functional to keep relationships together, or to draw someone into that relationship or get those attachment needs met. Excellent. Other theories we connected. Yeah.
I think there's arguments for all of them. They could all be applied somehow, but with family systems, like if one person in your family is having a lot of anger and that's not normal for the family, that's going to disrupt everybody else's usual trajectory, or not even trajectory, but just, what's that word? In the middle.
Homeostasis.
Yes, homeostasis.
Great.
And so that'll disrupt the system until that person is able to go back to what's normal, which is probably not anger, and bring everyone else back.
Right. So one way, right, because we can play with this. I love systems theory the most, right? Because we can play fun games with it. Because that anger may be a deviation from homeostasis, and we need to find things to bring it back, right? Another way to think about it is that anger is sometimes the way that we bring things back to homeostasis. Okay, if a child is out of line, I as a parent may use anger as a way to say, time to step back into line. What you're doing is out of control. Let's bring it back in, right? And so family systems theory gives us a chance to think about kind of those functions of anger and how does that maybe function to maintain homeostasis, manage feedback loops. We could do a whole thing about boundaries and hierarchy within there as well. Other theories that we were able to pick up on. Yes.
So conflict theory, two of the major assumptions are that humans are self-centered and that there's a scarce amount of resources, which can then cause conflict. So anger and not being able to achieve what you're wanting or get the resources that you need because you're an individual. So I guess that's more of an anger as an individual instead of relational, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I was actually really hopeful. Gold star for you today. I was hopeful someone would go for the conflict side of things, because it's also, as I was thinking about it, the whole crux of this article we're going to talk about today is trying to change this idea that anger is always bad, right? That anger can actually help. And conflict theory lets us ask some of those questions as to why do we even have that idea. And we may want to ask questions about who gets to set the norms and who gets to set the expectations. People who are doing well and have plenty of resources don't have nearly as much need to be angry about things. And conflict theory can help us think about the ways that maybe anger has been stigmatized or seen as problematic because it's a way to maintain power. It's a way to keep those who don't have resources in check. A great example of this is when you look at politicians. When a male gets angry, he's seen as strong. When a female gets angry, she's seen as shrill, right? She's seen, we talk about tone all the time in cases of both gender and racial dynamics, that when someone who is less powered in society gets angry, that's highly stigmatized, highly pushed back. So conflict theory gives us all sorts of fun things to look at when it comes to anger. All right, any others? I'm satisfied, but if anyone had any other ideas that they want to throw out there, that would be excellent too. Okay, we'll come back to one more here as well. But I want to ask the question, does the around middle range theories. Does that language is that meaningful to people? No, maybe a little. I'm seeing some people wanting to say it is, but maybe it's not yet. Because middle range theories move from here, right? Some of these are big, heavy duty theories. A middle range theory is one that is going to be much more specific to a specific phenomenon, to a specific thing that's going on. This article that you read and the chart that it developed is a good example of what we would call a middle range theory, where these, right, conflict theory is going to let me talk about anger, it's going to let me talk about economics, it's going to let me talk about race, I can go all over the place with conflict theory. Our theory today, right, this Butler article is much more constrained and focused on a smaller piece, and that's really valuable. That's a useful thing that we are going to talk about, and the real value of those middle range theories is we get to spend our time verifying them. Okay, we're gonna spend some time saying, does this fit? What are the limits of this theory? But then they are also eminently practical to say, what does this say we can do to intervene? Okay, so we're gonna dance around these a bit and come here and back, but we're also going to mostly focus on this smaller middle range theory that Butler and his colleagues have suggested, and I want us to come at this critically, right? I've seen in your guys' raps that you're supposed to be coming at these critically and saying, does this fit, does this not, and to really take some time to understand that. So that's really where I want to go. Does that make sense? Any questions on any of that? Okay, so with that, I just want to kind of get a general reaction, thoughts, comments, questions about the article, things that stood out, things that didn't make sense, and then we'll go through it a little more thoroughly and have some more specific discussions. But what did people think? What stood out to people? Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that you always associate anger with like that's bad, control your temper, and so I just thought the perspective that you could even consider it as like a good helping process was an interesting take that I'd never thought about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, and yes, I think that's great. Thinking about the ways that we have this social discourse that anger is bad, right? You need to temper that. You need to keep that down. To start to look and maybe break some of that expectation is really interesting. Yeah, and so we'll get into that more as well.
I like that it was integral in order to have a complete relationship, you have to be able to express anger. That's important.
Right, and that's another piece, right? Because we have one where it's like maybe it's okay to maybe overgeneralize how you said that, but then also to recognize that if we really read the article, what he's saying, what his contention is that you have to have that anger. Without that anger, then things are not going to go well. Great. Other things that stood out. Yeah.
Going along with both of those a little bit, just like anything, it has to have a direction. Because if we just have anger and we don't direct it, and we don't try to put it in the right places, then it turns into a negative thing. And I think that can happen with any emotion. And so just thinking about that, like when I encounter anger, how do I handle it? What ways do I cope, and what ways do I use it to do something better?
Right. Yes, I think that the scriptural language of bridling our passions, right, is that idea of we have those feelings, we have those experiences, and it's a question of how we're going to work with that, how we're going to steer that. Okay. Interestingly, to go to the ranch, we had an equine program there, and it was really interesting. I always just thought horses are horses, and you just go and ride horses. And it was actually really amazing to watch the girls there, how much they struggled, right? Because it takes, my experience there. I don't want to speak for all horse riders out there, but it takes some pretty good mental capacity and empathy and being responsive to the horse to be effective. And so these girls weren't allowed to ride for quite a while until they built some of those capacities. It was interesting because we then took a group of therapists and we put them through the same equine program, and they were able to pick up on it really quick, and which is what we would hope from our therapists, right? And it was pretty validating to see how that their ability to manage just made their relationship with the horse go so much smoother and so much quicker. All right, so let's go through, let's talk about, dive into a few of the specific pieces of this model. And really what I've done is I've pulled out some specific quotes that I want us to look at, and then especially to do a bit of critiquing, okay? I want us to critique whether this fits, whether this doesn't. Again, a middle range theory is not meant to be all things to all situations. So we should be able to find places where maybe this doesn't fit, maybe something is outside of here, because the danger is always when we take a theory and apply it to something where it doesn't fit without being critical and evaluating that well. So starting off, one of the first things that really stood out in the article was this contention, this statement that the function of anger is first self-protection, second relational coordination. Okay, who can break down what that means? How do we understand what's going on there? If you want star brownie points, connect it to some of our other theories as to what's going on here. We got half of that already. Yeah.
So this quote stood out to me while I was reading it as well. And for myself, I associated with the first concept of self-protection with the act of not excusing your partner's behaviors if they are harmful and if they truly hurt you, and holding them accountable, not because you want to punish them, but because you expect more of them and you expect more from your relationship. And so that sort of goes into the second part of the relational coordination, that you're doing it because you want your relationship to reach its full potential. And you can't do that if you're not taking responsibility for your actions and if you're just letting things slide.
Right. Yes. And so, in therapy terms or parent training terms, we may refer to this as assertiveness training, right? That idea of that anger being functional for us to get our needs taken care of as well, because we have just as much right to be taken care of in a relationship if we've been hurt to take care of ourselves, right? Does that fit with what you're saying? Right? This is the piece that we connected to attachment theory. The self-protection. What theory would we take that for? Can we connect it with one of our theories? Evolutionary. Yeah. So, at a very basic level, this is kind of an instinctual evolutionary psychology approach to say that we as living organisms need to take care of ourselves. And so anger, right? If we get punched, we get angry and punch back or run away or do something to protect ourselves. And so again, then looking at systems theory, right? One of the basic tenets of systems theory as we look at problems is to think about the ways that adaptive solutions, things that were working well, have become maladaptive. Okay? And so we get this makes it sound like, heck yeah, let's get as much anger as we can, and coordinate our relationships. But recognizing the ways that those adaptive processes may be becoming maladaptive.
Also, you can't help the relationship until you really understand what's going on. And that, I think, is a part of that self-preservation. You have to be able to look at the situation and actually understand how it is affecting you, what's going on before you can go to relational coordination.
Right. And I think what you're hinting at is this idea of, I don't know what we're going to call it, SIRO, S-I-R-O, self in relation to others. Okay. How did we understand that? What would be the one or two sentence explanation that people would give to that concept within this model? Well, how well did we get it, or is that something that is more of a struggle? Yeah.
It seemed like kind of a hierarchy or a power dynamic. Like if you felt like your, if you had inflated self-esteem or like maybe diminished, like if you felt like you were better than the other person, related to the other person, or worse than them, kind of on a hierarchy or power level.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily like relational power, maybe, I don't know, but like more in terms of like how you view yourself.
Yeah. Yes. Right. I think that idea of, I think power is an appropriate word there to say, where are you putting yourself in terms of this person? Can we connect that? This is a broad question, and if the answer is no, that's fine. I will do it for you. Okay. Can we connect this to concepts in other theories or models? Like, do people notice echoes in any other models?
Would that be a part of that secure base in the attachment theory?
Yeah, so attachment theory, again, my impression is Mark Butler likes attachment theory. Right? Is that safe to say? You can see some hallmarks of attachment theory in this idea of self in relation to others, where that avoidant attachment style is going to be more that inflated, where they're going to push other people away, they're going to focus more on themselves. That anxious attachment style is going to be dependent and need, and it will more often absorb injuries or absorb problems just to maintain that relationship. And a secure attachment is going to be secure. They're going to be able to appropriately manage independence and dependence. Do we see echoes in anything else? Can we recognize other models in there? I say this dynamic of that independence to dependence is one of the hallmarks of a number of different models. So for the marriage and family therapy interested people, one of the concepts of differentiation of self will arise in Bowen family systems theory. It does the same thing, just uses different language, looks at how people get fused in relationships, looks at how people get cut off in relationships. It's just different language for a very similar thing. For the social workers, there's a good chance you'll be trained in dialectical behavioral therapy. It does the same thing. It uses the language of wise mind, is that secure or balanced piece. Rational mind is going to be that inflated. Emotional mind is going to be that collapsed. And so I say that to emphasize that this idea of self in relation to other is a key place of a lot of different theories. And so it makes good sense that this is going to play a major role here. Right? Any other thoughts or comments around that idea of self in relation to others? Okay. So let's, before taking that next step, right, let's dive into this. This got hinted at. But just from the idea, furthermore, we again assert that individuals in relationships would be at even greater risk in the total absence of anger signaling and action. Okay, this is getting at that idea of not only is anger potentially useful, anger is necessary. How do we feel about that? Does that fit? Can we critique that? Are there examples where that doesn't fit? How are we doing with that? Yes.
I for one agree with it. If you think of like being a missionary, every week as a missionary you do a weekly planning session, and at the end of the weekly planning session you do a companionship inventory. And in that it has all of these things for you and your companion to discuss so that you can discuss the relationship of the companionship. And in that, one of the steps is ask your companion for ways to improve. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is something that can bring up a lot of anger. And I know on my mission, the more I was honest with my companion about things that they were doing that upset me, the faster we could work through it so that we could focus on what we needed to focus on. So I feel like in my life I've seen that the more you're willing to talk about it and work through it in a positive way, even if that includes anger, it's a good thing rather than just keeping it all in.
I heard correctly. You're agreeing with it,
Yes,
and you're saying,
it's gospel sanctioned.
well, hold on, because what you said is that even if it includes anger, because this and later quotes would suggest that it must include anger.
Okay, then yes, it should include anger.
So you're gonna
Yes, in the
adapt
memory
towards
time.
saying
Yeah.
we need to be angry. Okay, back here.
I would say kind of yes and no. A few of us were just in marital relations class where I talked about Dr. John Gottman, and how there's a difference between like a good healthy complaint and maybe it's fueled by a little bit of anger, but the way you present it is gonna get more across than if you present it like angrily, well not angrily, but like what was it, intent or criticism. And so rather than attacking the person with your anger, you can kind of come at it of how you're feeling and use your anger to fuel a healthy complaint. So I think you can use it, but it's just how you use it, how you use your anger will determine the situation.
So if I heard right, you did the opposite thing where you started out hesitant of this, but then seemed to agree with it with your with your actual explanation that the anger is going to be there and it needs to be used appropriately. Okay, we're going all sorts of different ways. Whoever.
I was just gonna say that I think that sometimes we can say conflict, and I think that conflict isn't always anger, but I think like a healthy conflict is necessary for a relationship to continue, and I think that often can bring up anger, but it's not always. It's not a every time something happens you have to be angry in order for anything to be solved. But sometimes anger can fuel conflict and sometimes conflict can fuel anger, and it's just kind of that balance between are we yelling at each other all the time or are we having healthy conflict where we're actually resolving matters.
Right, and I think this is a good conversation to have, and you know, some of my students that I work with, they're always accusing me of philosophizing and like playing word games and this and that, and probably true, and I like to do that because for me, as a therapist, anger is a funny thing because in almost all cases I see anger as a mask. Right? When people are angry, what's actually going on is there's some level of hurt going on. I think a lot about people feeling hurt, and I think it's appropriate to express that hurt. Whether that means anger or not, I'm not 100% sure. I think, so I have a client I worked with once, and we were talking about sexual assault. And after we were talking about it, I said, you know, how are you feeling? And she's like, angry. And it's like, heck yeah, like that makes a lot of sense. Like, I wouldn't want to take that from you. And it comes from this place of hurt, like she was preyed upon. There was that difficulty. And so, again, there may be those word games, but for me, I like to think a little more expansively and say, anger may fit, but I think that hurt and that expression of hurt, I think that's where I like to go. Maybe because I like that tenderness. I like that more tender piece, as it were. So, but again, I think that's the key piece of this critique that we make to say, does that make sense? Or maybe are we looking at something a little differently?
That's what I was thinking about, is maybe a better definition of what anger means, what they're defining anger as, because some of it could be hostile and other, you're just feeling hurt. So yeah, I like the word games because it actually helps me to understand better.
Right, yes, and on both a academic level and then also on a individual level when we're working with someone or working with our partner, to say like, what do you mean? You're saying angry. Help me understand that. Like, what's going on there?
Well, I really liked in the article it actually made that distinction. It called it aggressive anger and assertive anger, and I really liked how they did that because Yeah, like you were saying, it makes that distinction, and aggressive anger is not a good thing, but assertive anger can be healing and helpful. And I think that if, like, that's the problem with saying the absence of anger without clarifying in that quote, because I don't think an absence of aggressive anger is going to be a bad thing.
Yes. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And really what we're doing, right, this is the fun part of family studies, is that we're taking these really nebulous things. Okay, if I tell my wife, do you know when you made that joke around our friends, that really hurt? That's a false story. That's what I do to her. I make jokes and she comes and tells me that really hurt. Is that anger? In ways we could identify that with this benevolent indignation. That can fit. Would I call that anger? No, I don't think I would in my day to day. And yet it may fit with this theory. Right? This could work and help us understand some things. I got 5 minutes, okay? What I want us to do, I'm just gonna skip all of that. Because my impression is people have read this really well. Oh, when I took a screenshot, I got my little thing in there. So, the question that I'm most interested in asking here is, what then do we do with this? Okay, we've got just a couple more minutes here. What does this theory suggest about intervention? Above and beyond what they suggested, they had a bit of stuff in there. But as we think about this, right, if we're going to accept this model, what does it suggest? What should we be doing because of it or in connection with it? Can we apply it?
I think one thing that I thought when I read this was I can look at some of the ways in which I react to situations in specific, like interpersonal conflicts or different different situations, and depending on how I react, I'm like, oh, I might have like an inflated sense of self-image right now, or that evaluation, or I might have a collapsed one, or I might have more of a balanced one. And so it's kind of, for me, a way to check in to see kind of how I might be perceiving our relationship.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was supervising one of our students at UCM the other day, and she was dealing with a client who had some just really significant problems. Just it felt a little bit hopeless from our perspective. From we meet with them once a week. How much good can we do? And one of the solutions that we came to was really just even spending some time labeling what's going on. Not even necessarily coming up with behavioral interventions, but just helping her build a little bit of awareness. And so that could be something, right? If we're intervening for ourselves, to do a self-assessment, to say when we're angry or when we're in the midst of conflict, to ask ourselves some questions. Am I feeling inflated? Am I feeling collapsed? Am I feeling balanced? And do that just to build some awareness. Similarly, if we're working with someone, sometimes you can just teach the model and then it lets you ask that question. Are you feeling inflated? Feeling collapsed? Feeling balanced? Great. Other things that stand out to people, like how might we use this as an intervention approach?
I think this isn't like a super deep thought or anything, but I feel like when you're helping someone identify their anger, if you can pinpoint, because sometimes the anger is not justified, and it's the fault of the individual, not what's been done to them. So I think if you can separate it into these different categories in those instances when maybe they're not exactly justified in what they're feeling, it's better than just like your opinion calling them on it, but actually having like evidence and like steps for them to follow so they can see it for themselves, that they're maybe not in the right situations.
Right. To reference back to DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, they would call it checking the facts. Do we to say, you're feeling angry, they may be going one way or the other. They may be hating themselves because they have that collapsed, or they may be blaming everyone around them, and to be able to just say, like, let's check the facts, let's see if that actually fits, if you have cause to be angry in any meaningful way. Other thoughts? Someone should read my mind, because I've got a really good thought about this. Okay. What would this suggest? We've been talking about moments when people are already angry. What does this suggest about the times between those moments? Is that a leading enough question that someone can read my mind from there? Yes.
I don't necessarily think I'm going to read your mind.
Go for it. It's all right.
I feel like it is a productive way of looking at where you can put your feelings. We talked about anger being a signaling place where you have action. So if I say to myself, anger's all bad, and it's either I look really hostile or I just internalize, and those are my only two options, then that's all that there is. But if I say there's a really balanced, healthy way to express the way that I feel, and it's okay to feel the way that I feel, but this is a really productive outlet to make this come back to homeostasis, to be where I want to be with this other person or whatever. I feel like it can be really productive use of them all.
Yeah. Well, and to piggyback off that a little, that in my mind, like, the anger stuff is interesting. In a way, anger is just another topic. Okay, when we think about this idea of self in relation to other, or attachment style, or differentiation of self, or wise mind, whatever we want to call it, that affects a lot of our areas of life, right? That affects all sorts of things. And taking these inventories or thinking about how we're reacting to things more generally is going to have a major focus on how we manage our anger as well. Okay, so for example, someone with an anxious attachment style is going to find themselves always relying on other people to help them figure out their identity. They're going to be swayed by the crowds or people's opinions or random things pretty frequently. That's a great area for intervention, to say, let's slow that down. Let's build your own ability to assert yourself. And then by doing that, as they build that ability, that then naturally fits with anger as well, right? Because that self in relation to other is a deep down piece. That's a bigger deal than just in connection with anger, right? Another piece, and this again brings us back to systems theory, is that this can get exploded in a systemic storm. I don't know. The question is, what do we do? What happens when we have one partner who is inflated and one person who's balanced? What does that look like? What does it look like when one's balanced and one's collapsed? What does it look like when both are inflated? Right? What does it look like when both are collapsed? Okay. Once we start thinking about systemic, dyadic, right, two people at a time, this becomes incredibly complex, and we get to think about all sorts of other options that go on here. So if you're familiar with the idea of the pursuer-distancer type relationships, we can see that as an inflated and a collapsed, right? We have one person who's coming, the other person's avoiding. That can fit in that framework, and we see that. That's a really tough thing to think through. You know, I love to think about the idea of how can we, as a partner, or as a parent, or as a therapist, or whatever we are, affect other people's self in relationship to others in the moment, right? Because this is a deep characteristic, but it's also one that is situational and contextual, right? It's going to vary from time to time. We're going to have to leave those kind of open because they only gave me 45 minutes. I know your guys' class normally goes longer, but this is the time they've given me. My hope is that this has been helpful, that this has been an interesting conversation, not just about anger, but about that ability to use and critique and apply theory in meaningful ways, because in my experience, that's such a key way that we go out as families, studies folks, as therapists, parents, or whatever, to solve problems and say, oh yes, this fits with this new problem, something that maybe Mark Butler himself has never really thought about, but we can maybe take some of this stuff and apply it elsewhere. So hopefully that, I don't know, never know, but I appreciate your guys' time and your participation. Have a nice day. Thank you guys.